Welcome back to OMBI Anganwadi. Until now, almost everything we have done in SQL has been query based. That is, we wrote SQL statements using select, which SQL Server executed and gave us the required result set. But what we can do in SQL Server is just not limited to data retrieval or data modification. We can also write a sequence of statements where one statement depends on the result of another. For example, we might first calculate a value, then store it somewhere, and then use that value to decide what we want to do next. And so, to do this, let's first introduce this concept called variables. So, using a simple analogy here, you can think of a variable as a named container which can temporarily store a value, and that value can be a numeric value or a non-numeric string value, decimal value, or dates as well. And instead of repeatedly writing the same value itself, we create a named container for this value and use the name later. Now we are moving on and we will understand how we can make use of variables. The first step which we have to follow is the variable declaration, where we introduce a variable by giving it a name followed by the data type. And the data type will help in deciding what kind of values that variable is capable of storing. And next, we assign a value to this variable followed by using the variable according to our needs. Let's practically look at how we can do it now. So for the declaration, we use this keyword called declare followed by the variable name. One very important thing to remember here is that a variable name always begins with @ as per the SQL syntax, followed by the variable name, which I will say v1 for example, and give it the data type int. This statement creates this temporary space or variable called v1, which is capable of holding numeric values. Next, if I have to assign some value to this variable, we use this keyword called set, and we say set @v1 equal to 5. So this statement assigns this 5 into this space or variable called v1. In the next statements, I can use it the way I want to. I can either just display what this v1 holds by saying select v1, and I can see the value. I can also perform other operations on it by declaring another variable here and saying @v2 int, and I can set the value for v2 as well and say set @v2 equal to 10. And what I wish to see could be the sum of v1 and v2, where I can say v1 plus v2. And this gives me the summation value. So if you notice something here, we are no longer just writing a single query, but we have written multiple steps here, and SQL Server executes these steps in a sequence. These two variables were declared first, and after this the values were assigned, and at last the sum of these two values were calculated and it was returned. This was one way of assigning values, that is using set, but SQL Server also allows us to assign values using a select statement. For a simple variable assignment where we directly use a value, we can make use of set, but in case you want to assign a value from another table, select keyword makes it more convenient to do this. So let's just declare a variable saying @count, and into this I want to store number of employees in the employee table. So for this, what we do is we just say select @count equal to count of star from human resources dot employee. The count which was extracted from this table has got stored into this variable. So next, when I say select @count, I can directly get that value. Now here comes another very important real requirement. Now you check the number of employees in this table, and in the next step you want to make a decision based on what number is returned. For example, let's say suppose you want to check the number of employees in this table, and if it is greater than 200, you want to show a message saying there are more than 200 employees, otherwise you want to display another message. So this is where the concept of decision making comes into picture, and for this we will be making use of our if-else statements. To understand in very simple terms on how an if statement works is that if statement first evaluates or checks a condition. If that condition is true, the next set of statements associated with that if is executed. But if the condition is false, the execution goes to the next set of statements. Let's see a small example of how we can write an if statement now. We will make use of this same example. We declared this variable called count and stored this value here. Next, I want to check for a particular condition, so I will say if count is greater than 200, I want to print a message, for which we will be using something called as a print keyword and put our message within single quotes and say more than 200 employees, else we will print less than 200 employees. Let's run it and see what is returned. Since I have select count also, I can see this under the results. Now let's go to messages and have a look. Anything you use along with this print keyword would be printed under the messages section. And since this count is having more than 200 employees, I can see this message more than 200 employees getting printed here. In case you want to execute more than one statement when a condition is true, that is if count is more than 200, you also want to say print condition is true and also more than 200 employees. In this case, there is a block under this if. We will have to make use of begin and end statements here. So this is one block, and in case you have multiple statements again under the else, you should also be making use of these begin and end keywords for the else part. Let's run it now. Again I can see 290 here, and because this first condition was satisfied, we can see both these statements getting printed. Condition is true and more than 200 employees. SQL also supports working with multiple conditions using more than one if statements and also making use of nested if. When we have to make use of multiple if statements, we make use of else if. The first condition starts with if, and then when the first condition doesn't hold true, SQL Server enters into this second condition where we write else if. I can also add another condition here. So the first condition checks if it is more than 200, but if this condition fails, I want SQL Server to check for another condition here where I can say else if count is greater than 100, and I can say print less than 200 but more than 100. If this condition also doesn't satisfy, I can say else very less. So now I have increased the number of statements. If both these conditions don't satisfy, then the else block is entered and it has to print very less. If you notice one thing here, SQL Server doesn't execute both these branches. That is, it doesn't execute both if and else if statements. It evaluates the condition, enters into the appropriate branch or block, and after executing the statements within that block, it leaves the if block and goes to the next statement. Here, like we see, the first condition itself holds true. So this block is executed, and without entering or even checking for these conditions, it directly entered this statement which is at the end of the if block and returned this value which is held by the count. So with the use of variables and value assigning to variables and if-else statements, we utilize the capacity of SQL Server to work with multiple sequential statements. And there is one very important distinction which we will discuss in this video, that is how case is different from if-else statements. Even though we feel that both case and if-else statements handle decision making, we use case within a query to determine a value for a particular row in the result set. But if-else statements controls which statement the SQL Server has to execute. Do like the video, stay tuned and subscribe to OMBI Anganwadi.